There's a rusted coffee can that sat behind my mother's stove for as long as I can remember, and by the end of most weeks, it held about 2 cups of strained bacon grease. That can was the difference between 6 kids eating good and 6 kids eating thin. I watched my mother pour hot drippings through a scrap of cheesecloth into that can more Saturdays than I can count. And if I ever let a spoonful of it slide off into the sink, she'd look at me like I'd thrown a dollar bill in the trash. Back in 1966, a bottle of store cooking oil ran somewhere around 49 cents, and 49 cents bought a lot more in our house than a bottle of oil. That can never got wasted. Not once. Not in all the years I lived under that roof. What I'm going to hand you today is a whole set of tricks that came out of that same kitchen. Things my mother did every single day without ever writing one of them on a card. And every one of them still works exactly the way it worked back then. None of it needs a special gadget. None of it will strip your cast iron or wreck a good pie crust or leave your greens tasting like a science project. And every bit of it costs pennies, because pennies were all we had. I'll tell you exactly what each one costs, right down to what you're likely paying for the store-bought version sitting on your shelf right now, so you can see the difference with your own eyes. My name is Linda. I've been keeping house for over 40 years, since before my husband Earl ever hung his first tool belt on a nail at that little roadside motel in Florida. I raised 3 kids, mostly on one paycheck, and there were plenty of years I never once bought a jar of store-bought gravy mix or a bottle of pie crust conditioner or a box of instant biscuit dough, because we simply didn't have the money for it, and because I'd been taught better than to need it. What I know from standing at my mother's elbow from the time I was tall enough to see over the counter, and from 40 more years of running my own kitchen after that. So here's my promise to you. By the time this video is done, you're going to have the exact method behind a whole list of old kitchen tricks, in the order that makes sense, with what they cost, and why they work. And here's the part that ought to bother you a little. Every single one of these was common knowledge in ordinary kitchens for generations, and most of it quietly disappeared in about 2 generations. Right around the same time the grocery store aisles filled up with a jar or a box or a mix for every single thing your grandmother used to just do with her hands. Nobody sat in a boardroom and plotted to make you forget how to render your own lard. It's just that a company makes more money selling you shortening in a tub than they do if you already know how to make your own for free. So nobody goes out of their way to remind you. Stay with me. By the end of this, you'll have a whole different way of looking at your kitchen and your grocery bill. Here's what most folks get wrong before we even start. They think old-fashioned cooking was about recipes, some secret ingredient list sitting in a drawer somewhere. It wasn't. My mother never used a written recipe that I ever saw. Not for biscuits, not for cornbread, not for a birthday cake. What she had wasn't a recipe. It was a feel for how dough should pull off the side of a bowl, and a nose for when beans needed more salt, and 40 years of watching batter hit a hot skillet and knowing exactly what it should sound like. A recipe card can tell you 2 cups of flour. It cannot tell you that flour behaves differently on a humid day than it does on a dry one, and that your hands are supposed to know the difference. That's the piece that got lost. Not the ingredients, the feel for them. So as I walk you through this, don't just listen for what goes in the bowl. Listen for what your hands and your nose are supposed to be doing while it's in there. We'll start with that coffee can, because it's the whole philosophy of that kitchen in one jar. Every bit of fat that came off a skillet, bacon, sausage, the drippings off a fried chicken, got strained hot through cloth and poured into that can. That fat was the cooking oil for the entire week. Eggs got fried in it. Cornbread got started with a spoonful of it. A pot of green beans got its backbone from it. It carries a smoke and a salt into food that you simply cannot buy in a bottle because it isn't really a fat, it's a seasoning that happens to be a fat. The only rule was you strained it while it was hot and let it settle, because the burnt little bits at the bottom will turn a whole can rancid if you leave them in. Strained clean, that fat kept on the back of a stove for a month without spoiling. For anything with a flaky crust, biscuits especially, my mother worked cold. Cold buttermilk straight from the icebox, and she'd run her own hands under the cold tap before she ever touched the dough. What she was after was little cold lumps of fat sitting inside that flour instead of melted through it. When that cold fat hits a hot oven, the water trapped inside it flashes into steam, and that steam is exactly what pushes the dough apart into layers. Warm hands melt the butter into the flour before it ever sees the oven, and once that happens, there's no steam left to make, and no layers to speak of, just a flat, dense little puck. Her rule was simple. If the dough ever started feeling greasy or slack under her hands, she stopped and set the whole bowl in the icebox for 10 minutes before going any further. And she barely touched that dough once it came together. Cut the fat in, wet it, bring it together, and stop. Maybe 10 seconds of handling total. Wheat flour builds something called gluten the second you work it with water. Long, stretchy strands that give bread its chew. And chew is the last thing you want in a biscuit. A kneaded biscuit comes out tough and tight. One that's barely touched comes out short and tender and falls apart the right way in your fingers. I raised 3 kids, and every single one of them made hockey pucks their first time at the biscuit bowl, and it was always the same reason. They were working that dough like it owed them money. Cornbread went into a cast iron skillet that had been heating in the oven with grease in it until that grease was just shy of smoking. And when the batter hit it, it hollered. That sizzle is the entire trick. Batter hitting metal that hot sets the crust in a second, so it crisps instead of soaking into the pan. And the sugars in the cornmeal start browning and turning toasty in a way they never manage on a slow warm-up. That's the crust a whole pan of cornbread lives or dies on. Pour that same batter into a cold pan, and you get a pale, soft brick with no bottom to it at all. Same meal, same buttermilk, same everything else. The only difference was the heat already sitting in that pan. Now, here's a small one that always surprises people. My mother put a splash of leftover cold coffee, whatever was sitting in the bottom of the pot, into every chocolate cake she ever baked. Food scientists have since worked out exactly why that works. Coffee and cocoa share some of the same flavor compounds, and the coffee grabs hold of the chocolate ones and pulls them up 2 or 3 times stronger. It doesn't make the cake taste like coffee at all. It makes the chocolate taste more like chocolate, and folks will swear you used a fancier cocoa when you didn't spend a dime more. Use it cold and leftover. Nobody's brewing a fresh pot just for a cake, and you don't need to. A pinch of salt went into everything sweet in that house. The cake batter, the pie filling, the cobbler. This one is real, not just a taste preference. Salt reaches your tongue and quiets the bitter notes in a food, while it lifts up the sweetness. So a pinch can make something taste noticeably sweeter without 1 extra grain of sugar. That mattered a great deal when sugar cost real money and you used no more of it than you had to. Leave the salt out of a dessert and it doesn't taste less salty. It just tastes flat and a little dead, and most people can't ever put a finger on why. A pot of beans went on the stove of a morning and simmered low until evening with nothing but a piece of fat back in it. 4, 5, 6 hours sometimes. What you're after in all that time is the beans breaking down and thickening their own liquid into a gravy. which is exactly why they're called soup beans and not boiled beans. Rush that same pot hot and hard, and the beans burst on the outside while the middle stays chalky, and the liquid never thickens up right. Salt went in at the very end, never at the start, because salt added early toughens the skins, and the beans will fight you the whole time they're cooking. And nothing with flavor in it ever went down our drain. The water off those beans, the liquid off a pot of greens, potato water, all of it got saved and worked back into something else. The liquid left from a pot of greens carries nearly everything that cooked out of them, the iron, the vitamins, the flavor, and you sop it up with cornbread because pouring it down the sink is pouring out half the meal. Potato water went straight into bread dough, where the starch feeds the yeast and the loaf rises higher and stays soft 2 extra days. A family that threw away nothing ate better than one that bought more and wasted half of it. And that's the whole economy of that kitchen wrapped up in one habit. Come the first tender lettuce of spring, my mother would tear it into a bowl and pour bacon grease over it straight off the skillet, boiling hot, with a splash of vinegar stirred right into that grease. It's called wilted lettuce, and the hot fat softens the greens in a matter of seconds, while the vinegar cuts through so it doesn't sit heavy on your tongue. It eats like a cooked green and a salad at the same time, and it landed at exactly the point every spring when the pantry was picked clean of just about everything else. The grease has to be truly hot, straight off the file, or you end up with a cold, greasy salad, which is a sorry thing to put in front of anybody. For gravy, my mother browned the flour in hot grease first, stirring it until it went the color of a paper sack before a single drop of milk ever touched it. That browning cooks the raw taste out of the flour, and it's the whole line between a gravy that tastes like paste and one that tastes like something worth eating. The milk goes in slowly, off the heat, or it seizes into lumps you'll never beat back out. A half pound of sausage, browned that way and stretched with milk and flour, fed our whole table of 8, and nobody ever rose from it hungry. That's not really a recipe. That's arithmetic done with a skillet. Buttermilk went into nearly everything in that kitchen because there was always butter being churned, and buttermilk is what's left behind. It does 2 jobs at once. The sourness in it, what the label would call lactic acid, meets baking soda and throws off carbon dioxide, which is your rise. And that same acid works on the proteins in the flour and tenderizes the crumb while it's at it. That's why a buttermilk biscuit comes out soft, where one made with sweet milk comes out tight. And here's the part most folks get backwards. Once that dough is mixed, you get it into a hot oven fast, because the soda and the buttermilk start throwing off their gas the moment they touch, and that gas doesn't wait around for you. Let a biscuit dough sit on the counter, and a good part of your rise has already floated off into the air before it ever sees the heat. You chill the dough for the steam and the layers, but you rush it into the oven for the gas, both at the same time. My mother's own mother kept a stone crock going on the back of her stove, cabbage or cucumbers packed down under salt, with a scalded plate and a clean rock holding it all beneath the surface of its own brine. The salt holds off the things that would spoil the vegetable, while the good bacteria already living on it eat the sugar and turn it sour. And once it's sour enough, nothing harmful can survive down there. It cost nothing to run. No jars, no lids, no canner, just a crock and patience. The one rule that mattered was that the vegetable had to stay under the brine the entire time. Let a piece bob up into the air and it molds, and that mold can take the whole crock down with it. A spoonful of plain vinegar went into the water for pie crust, and my mother did it because her mother did it before her. The acid in that vinegar keeps the gluten from building up tough while you're working the dough, so the crust stays tender instead of turning to leather, and every trace of that sour cooks off completely in the oven, so nobody ever tastes it in the finished pie. It bought her a little forgiveness, a crust that could handle being rolled and re-rolled when she was making 4 pies at once for a funeral supper and moving fast. There was no thermometer hanging in that kitchen either, and my mother fried in lard that was exactly hot enough every single time, because she'd drop a pinch of cornmeal or a bead of water into it and read what it did. Meal that just sits there means the fat's too cold, and your chicken will soak it up greasy. Meal that scorches black and smokes means it's too hot, and your chicken burns outside while it stays raw in the middle. Meal that dances and browns slow and even, that's the window. And 40 years of frying taught her exactly what that dance looked like. I did some of my own version of this work later on. Back in the years I helped out at the motel doing breakfast for 60 rooms some mornings when things got short-handed. There is no faster way to learn how hot is too hot for a skillet of eggs than 60 plates riding on getting it right. And I promise you, that lesson never left me. My grandmother, my mother's own mother, kept a whole different set of habits going that my mother carried forward without ever questioning them. Green beans got strung whole on a length of thread with a sewing needle and hung behind the stove to dry for weeks, gathering what looked like dust the whole time. They'd dry down to nothing, hard and papery, and keep in a paper sack for a full year. What's happening is simple. The water is leaving the bean, and below a certain point, nothing that causes spoilage can survive in there. The same principle behind jerky and behind every dried food you've ever eaten. Come January, you'd soak a handful overnight and simmer them for 2 or 3 hours with a little fat back, and they'd come back to life tasting deeper and a little funkier than a fresh bean ever does, which mountain families came to prefer outright. The one thing that mattered was where they hung. Dry air moving past them, or they'd mold on the string instead of drying, and a moldy one gets thrown straight in the trash. No soaking and hoping about it. My grandmother also wrapped a soft dough of ground corn and beans in soaked corn shucks, tied it tight, and boiled it, a dish that traveled down from the Cherokee families who'd lived on that same land long before her people ever arrived. The wrap does 2 jobs at once, holding the dough together in boiling water so it doesn't just cloud off into the pot, and lending its own flavor into the food from the inside out. There's something underneath that dish nobody sat down and planned for. Corn is short on one thing your body needs, and beans are short on something else entirely, and the two together happen to fill each other's gaps. So a meal built on both leaves you fed in a way that either one alone never quite manages. People lived on that pairing for centuries before anybody could have told you why it worked so well. The tie on that shuck bundle has to be snug, or the water gets in and you pull a bag of mush out of the pot instead of bread. And before anybody in our family ever bought a packet of yeast from a store shelf, there was a crock of sourdough starter kept alive on the back of my grandmother's stove. Flour and water gone wild with whatever was floating around in that kitchen air. Fed a little and used a little and fed again, some years older than her own children. That crock was how bread got made, full stop. And it never died as long as somebody remembered to feed it on schedule. Starters got passed down through a family like a piece of furniture, and letting one go too long without feeding meant losing it for good. If it had been your grandmother's starter, you didn't get that particular one back. You got a new one that simply wasn't hers. If an old housewife's tricks like these are worth your time, go ahead and hit subscribe and tap that thumbs up. It tells me you want more of this kind of thing, and I've got plenty more where it came from. And that brings me to the last one, which my mother would have laughed if you'd ever called it a trick at all. She never measured a single thing in that kitchen. Not a cup, not a spoon, not once in all the years I watched her. A handful of this, a couple fingers of that, flour added until it looked right, salt added until the pot smelled right. She knew a biscuit dough was ready by how it pulled off the side of the bowl. She knew a cake was done by the smell of it before she ever opened the oven door. That's not sloppiness. It's the opposite. It's knowing a thing so deeply in your hands that a measuring cup would only slow you down. Because a cup of flour weighs a little different on a wet day than it does on a dry one. And her hands knew the difference, while a cup never could. Now, why doesn't any of this get talked about much anymore? Simple arithmetic, and I don't need a business degree to lay it out for you. A jug of buttermilk runs you a couple of dollars, and it will leaven, tenderize, and flavor a month of baking. A can of shortening with chemical conditioners already mixed in costs more and does one job. Rendering your own lard from fat you'd otherwise throw away costs nothing but time, and it makes a pie crust that shatters the way a store-bought crust never quite manages. A coffee can of strained bacon grease replaces a whole bottle of cooking oil for free because you already paid for that bacon. None of this is a mystery. It's just that nobody makes money selling you something you already know how to make yourself, so nobody's in a hurry to remind you that you can. Think about a jar of sourdough starter kit sold online for around $15, when flour and water left on a counter for a week will get you the very same thing for free, given a little patience and a lot less hurry. Think about the packets of dried bean seasoning mix sitting near the canned goods, when a piece of fatback and 6 slow hours on the stove does the same job for the price of the fatback alone. None of this is complicated math, and none of it requires giving anything up. It just requires knowing that the free version was sitting there in your own kitchen the whole time, under a different name, waiting on you to remember it. I put this whole system, this one and dozens more from my years running a household on not much money at all, into a little book I call Linda's Homekeeping Handbook. The link is right there in the description if you'd like to have it all in one place. So here's what I want you to do this weekend. Start a coffee can behind your own stove and strain your bacon grease into it instead of pouring it down the drain. It costs you nothing but a scrap of cloth. Next time you make biscuits, chill your butter and your bowl for 10 minutes and handle that dough as little as you possibly can. Heat your cast iron skillet with grease in it before the cornbread batter ever goes in, and listen for that sizzle. Splash a little leftover coffee into your next chocolate cake. It won't cost you a thing since it's already sitting in the pot. And the next time you're frying something, put the thermometer away for one meal and just watch how a pinch of cornmeal moves in the fat. Every single one of these will cost you pennies, and every one of them will teach your hands a little more of what my mother's hands knew. Tell me in the comments where you're from and what your own grandmother or your mother used to do in her kitchen that she never wrote down anywhere. The kind of thing you only know because you stood there and watched her do it. I read every single one of these, and I'd love to know whose hands taught you what you know. Next time, I'm going to show you the laundry line trick my mother used that got stains out of my father's work shirts that nothing in a modern bottle has ever matched. And I'll tell you exactly why it worked and what it cost her, which was next to nothing. The women who kept this country's homes running knew things we're only just starting to remember.